Okay, thank you. I'm Tiffany Doan. I work at Avon Park Air Force Range through Archbold, and my title is which method is better for surveying herpetofauna and the upland habitats of Florida, pitfall or camera traps? And I presented this talk at the Society for the Study of Amphibians and Reptiles and Partners for Amphibian and Reptile Conservation meeting in Michigan. And this paper was recently submitted to the Wildlife Society Bulletin. I'm sorry. So there have been a lot of methods that have been developed for studying herpetofauna, and it's really important to figure out which methods are best for whether you're studying herps, whether you're studying plants, whatever it is, you need to figure out which methods are the best ones for your study animals or other study organisms. For reptiles and amphibians, pitfall trapping is a method that's been used for a long time, has a long history, and is a really good method. You can catch lots and lots of animals, very good for population studies, community studies, but there are cons to that. It does take a lot of time in the field. When the pitfall traps are open, you've got to check them every single day, at least in Florida. I guess in some other places you could get away with checking them less. But that if you don't check them often enough, you can end up with mortality, or sometimes you have mortality even if you are doing the right things. So camera trapping is a relatively new method to be used with reptiles and amphibians, only since about the first publications were in 2017. And so some pros for that is you have much less field effort. You just sort of set it and forget it almost. No mortality associated with that, but it can be very expensive to buy all these cameras, and there's a lot of processing time of sitting in a computer and staring at pictures. There have been really few studies that have compared these two methods. There have been a few that have done some and talked a little bit about the differences and pros and cons. But what I wanted to do is test them exactly the same way at the exact same time at a really large scale, and to really make some conclusions about which one is better. And the assemblage we have in the uplands at Avon Park is about 36 reptile and amphibian species. So that's a pretty diverse group of herps. So as I said, I'm working at Avon Park Air Force Range, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but in case you're not, it's in both Polk and Highlands counties, right there in the middle of the state. It's a huge area, 106,000 acres of very well-protected habitat. The habitats that I'm working in are pine flatwoods. There's a massive extent of pine flatwoods. It's very nicely protected at Avon Park. Dry prairie and Florida scrub. Those are the three habitats I'm working in. And then also the ecotones between them, so the scrubby flatwoods and the prairie flatwoods ecotone. All of these are upland habitats that are fire dependent habitats, and they are maintained regularly with prescribed burning at that area. So as I said, there's around 36 species, and I say around because sometimes you have individuals coming from other habitats, so we get more than that at times. So 9 amphibian species, 27 reptile species. The ones that are written on here and you see the pictures of are the ones that are threatened or endangered by the state of Florida or the federal government, but there are a lot more species. We're studying these, but also interested in everything we can find. So for this project, I installed 60 plots around the range, spread of about 30 kilometers. 12 plots were placed randomly in each habitat or ecotone, and the plots are a hectare in size. And in the very center is a drift fence array, and a drift fence is, I'll show you pictures in a moment, but the way I have deconstructed them, they have 3 arms coming off of a center point. The arms are 10 meters long, and there are fences in the ground, countersunk about 15 centimeters under the ground, so that anything that's fossorial will run into the fence and then be captured. The typical behavior of most animals when they run into a fence is to turn and follow that fence to the end in one direction or the other, not just turn around and go away. So they are directed at the end of the fence, either into a trap or a camera, so that I can record them. And so what I did is half of these have cameras and half of them are pitfall traps, which I'll show you in a second. I have to point out that I could never have done all of this without an army of students helping me install these. It's really hard work. And so all of these guys made this possible. And so for the pitfall traps, what I have is at the center and each of the ends, I have 19-liter buckets, so 5-gallon buckets sunk into the ground. Along each arm of the fence, I have funnel traps, so little bidirectional funnels that direct an animal, especially snakes, go into the funnels and are not able to figure out how to get out, even though they're not technically trapped. I sample the pitfall traps every 6 weeks for 8 days in a row, and that's about twice per quarter. And then when I'm not trapping, I close up the buckets and take the funnel traps away so that I don't accidentally catch animals when I'm not there. And so this is one you can see in pine flatwoods habitat. You can see this is the center and then the triad formation, and there are the funnel traps along the fence. And then you can't see the buckets because they're underground, but a bucket in the center and along the edges. For the camera traps, the fence is built exactly the same way, but instead in the center, I have a bucket that's flipped upside down with a camera screwed into it and facing down towards the lid that's attached. And there are cutouts in the bucket so that the animals, when they go there, they'll run into the bucket, get their picture taken, and then go out the other side. And there have been, this is based on a similar method called a drift that other people have used, but have modified it slightly. And the camera is focused down to 28 centimeters, which is a little bit above the bottom, so a little bit above the lid, so that animals will be in very nice focus. So this is a camera trap array. This is in scrub. You can see the center bucket, which has the camera and the same sort of fencing. The photo on the right is taking the bucket and flipping it up and taking a picture down into the bucket, just so you can see what it looks like with the camera bolted onto the bottom, and then the cutouts and the guides to guide the animal directly under the lens of the camera. So I analyzed this in multiple ways. I did a Shannon index. I looked at the differences in between pitfall traps and camera traps by testing abundances by species. I tested pairs of traps, so the funnel trap, or sorry, the pitfall funnel array and the camera array that were closest to each other. I paired them to try to see if there were differences that way by species and by abundance. And then also I had to take into account that the cameras are running 24/7, whereas the funnel and pitfall traps, I only have running for 8 days every 6 weeks. So I did another test looking at taking those hours of trapping into account. And then I also did a cost analysis for method so that other researchers could decide, is it cost effective to do this? So I had, in this 11-month sampling period, I sampled 7 pitfall trap sampling, which ended up to be 1,680 trap days, 315 days of cameras, which is over 200,000 hours of camera footage. And that gave me a total of 2,372 individuals of 34 different species, 34 different reptile and amphibian species. I also was able to record 9 mammal and 3 bird species, which is not what I was looking for, but I found them as well. I just threw this up here, these habitat type abundances, just for interest. It's not really what I'm looking at. Scrub has the highest abundance, but the other habitats have a lot as well. Prairies tends to have the least. Okay, so for the question, in funnel traps, I caught 461 individuals versus 1,900 and so individuals in camera traps. I caught 28 species in pitfall and funnel traps versus 23 species in the camera traps. The Shannon index was higher in the pitfall traps than the camera traps. And pitfall traps had 10 unique species that were not captured in the cameras, whereas camera traps had 6 unique species that were not captured in the pitfall and funnel traps. So this table has everything that's way too much to look at. If you want to pick out your favorite species and look at it, maybe you can see it, I'm not sure. But I just wanted to show all the different species. And then here on the bottom, in the middle here, that is what one of the photographs from the camera looks like. So that's a scrub lizard there. And you can see this is the lid of the bucket, and I have a ruler there for size comparisons. Here is this is one of the funnel traps of the snake that I took out of it. That's a pygmy rattlesnake. And then these are just some other animals that we caught in the traps, and I posed for pictures. So as far as this list goes, as I said, it's a lot too much, but I did want to point out one thing is up here in the amphibians. So as you can see, the cameras tend to catch a lot more individuals because, as I said, they're running all the time. But for the amphibians, the cameras are actually kind of pathetic. We caught a lot more species and individuals in the pitfall and funnel traps than with the cameras. So as far as statistical significance, there were no differences in abundances by species. In the paired plots, the cameras had significantly more individuals, which is not surprising, but they had the same, more or less the same species richness, and there were no differences in abundances per method by trap day either. So not a lot of differences, a lot of significant differences found between the two methods. In the cost comparison, it was kind of the same. And we could get into the details of all this, but we don't need to right now. Basically, for the pitfall traps, the labor is a lot more in the field. Also, installing those traps takes more effort because installing the buckets takes quite a bit of time. But the cameras are very expensive. So in the end, for each trap, these are the costs. It's pretty much the same. Not a huge difference. So the question was, which method is better? If you're looking at amphibians, it's better to do pitfall at funnel trapping. The cameras did not catch many of the amphibians. For reptiles, the richness is about the same. Abundance is much higher with the cameras. And the costs are pretty similar, as I said. The camera arrays are slightly more expensive. One thing is that the funnel traps that I got were very expensive. I had to buy them in Australia. And if I was able to get cheaper funnel traps, which I wasn't because they just don't make good funnel traps in the United States, then the pitfall trap funnel trap arrays would have been much less expensive than the camera trap arrays. And so, oops, sorry, too far. So which method is better? It really depends on the goals of your study. For population studies, if you're trying to do marker capture, probably better to do pitfall trapping. But for some species in the cameras, you could use them. You could use photo ID. For example, southeastern five-line skinks have unique color patterns on their backs and their tails. So I can actually identify a lot of individuals with those. But other species, probably not. If you're trying to do an assemblage-wide study, really a combination of the two methods is best. They're really complementary, and they sort of fill in the gaps of the other one. And so the ideal trap would be one that has a camera in the center, and along the other ends, you would have the buckets. And so that's actually what I'm doing now. I have changed all of my traps, or I'm in the process of changing all my traps to ideal traps. A student drew this for me, but this is what we're looking at now, is having the camera in the middle and then on the pitfall traps on the ends. So this research was funded by the Department of Defense, and I'd like to thank them for that, and then a whole bunch of individuals that helped me in various aspects of this project. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Were there any questions? Yeah, I'll get that next. Thank you. Go ahead.
That was a really interesting talk. I think I'm in here. I'm curious if there's a with reptiles like a size bias to the camera traps, because like presumably some larger snakes and like the gopher tortoises would be less efficient in the 5-gallon funnel traps, but then maybe smaller lizards more in the funnel traps than in the cameras.
Yeah, so there definitely is so the cameras can take, like a big gopher tortoise can't fit in there, but pretty much anything else can. There's big gaps. So indigo snake, whatever large snake can get in there. Even box turtles have gotten themselves in there. I don't know how, because they don't really fit, but they do it. So they can get in there. The pitfall traps are size limited in that larger snakes can just get out. So they fall in, but they get out. And large lizards like race runners, they can get out as well. Most of the mammals can get out as well, except for the small mice and shrews. We catch them in the buckets. So there definitely is a size thing. Also, the funnel traps are not huge, so the biggest indigo snakes cannot be caught in there, but I have caught pretty big pine snakes in there. And I could certainly catch smaller indigo snakes if they're around and I could find them. Catch them as well. So there are size biases for sure.
All right. We have one online, which we'll do next.
Sure.
I'm curious about your process for identifying the camera images. Is it a manual process?
Manual,
And do you see
yeah.
any room for using any machine learning algorithms to identify the species?
Maybe, but I don't know, whole training would be a lot of effort. And it's really not because, I mean, it does take a really long time, but it's doable to go through all the images.
Yeah. So the online question, Laura. Oh, see it. Well, let's start with the first one. Got a minute.
So Joe online asks, why so few amphibians with the camera?
Great questions. The question is, yes, why are there so few amphibians? I don't know. I don't really understand other camera projects have gotten amphibians. I really don't know why. I wish, yeah, that's a big question for me. I'm not really sure.
But one more.
All right. So did you not see any pocket gophers? This is just a side question before the real one.
Nope. Well, no, we do get a lot of mice, Florida mice especially. We get a lot of shrews, sometimes hispid cotton rats, but no other, and a couple other mice species, but no pocket gophers.
Okay. All right. So the last one, while I'm trying to swap over, I need time to swap over now. Did you see any potential differences between methods with respect to detection of rare species?
Not really. It's, rare species are hard. We've gotten moleskinks pretty much equally in both methods. The only pine snake no, actually not true. I've gotten one of each in the pine snakes recently. I got one in the cameras, so not really, kind of the same.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off. Thank you very much, Tiffany. And our next speaker is Greg Sonnier. Greg, here's the mic for you. And I'll let you introduce you. Greg is a research biologist.
Can everyone hear me online? All right. Well, stop.
Laura tells me we have about 29 people online now. So great to have you all there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So this is a bit of a different talk. I've not given this talk. It's a brand new talk that I prepared for the symposium. And it's not about data we collected, or it's more about what we're planning to do and why we're doing it. So it's a brand new project that we started this year at the ranch. And it's about enhancing wetland services and functions in graze wetland and the use of innovative technologies. First, I wanted to just mention that we're working on a specific type of wetland, which are seasonal depressional wetland or geographically isolated wetland. Some of you who are from the Midwest might know them as prairie potholes, or if you're from California, vernal pools. Okay. Why we're working on them is that because they provide enormous amount of ecosystem services. They're hotspot for diversity. They're really important for carbon sequestration, water quality, water retention. And you probably have some in the scrub, but we also see them often on ranches. In fact, at Buck Island Ranch, they represent about 16% of our landscape. And because they're embedded in they're embedded in a rangeland system, they are experiencing different environmental drivers that I'm trying to symbolize here. So you have this left bucket here, which we call pasture type or intensity of management, which group like factors such as whether the pasture has been ditched, whether it's a fertilized pasture, whether it was planted with forage palatable grasses. Then you have the second big factor, big bucket, which is cattle grazing. Do you have grazing or do you not have grazing in those wetlands? And finally, you have prescribed fire, because we use prescribed fire as a way to manage the land. You're probably aware of this for the people that have been working at Archbold for quite some time, but we have more than 20 years of research on those seasonal depressional wetlands at Buck Island Ranch, where we were interested in biodiversity, whether it's plant, but also arthropod, fish, and amphibian diversity. We have multiple papers on these topics. We also looked at other ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration, water filtration, water quality, and forage production and forage quality. Using those individual metrics, we can look at like multifunctionality, and we can see that I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to at least show it once. On the left, this is what we call, oops. Okay. On the left, you have those are like spider plots. And each on the left is what we have for the different ecosystem functioning in the semi-native pasture, in the semi-native wetland. And on the right, it's the wetland embedded in improved pasture. And here are just the level of ecosystem functions that we observe in 4 different trees. So we have an experiment at the ranch that we've been following for more than 20 years, where you have fence and burn wetland, you have graze and burn, and then you have the graze unburn and graze and. So as you can see, those different treatment have like a significant effect on the level of ecosystem multifunctionality you have in those wetlands. So I'm going to spend a bit more time on one aspect, which is the grazing aspect. And I want to highlight the fact that a lot of our work, and in fact, a lot of the work on wetland when it comes to grazing is focused really on comparing graze versus ungraze. So ambient grazing versus no grazing at all. And if you look at the literature, when it comes to most of the research looking at grazing intensity, which is different level of grazing intensity, there's not really much research on wetland, especially in subtropical wetland system. So this is what drove our questions and our goal for this project. And the first one is what is the effect of different grazing intensity on wetland services and function? Here I just give you like example of what we could expect for different wetland function or services. So you can have a like linear relationship with positive relationship with grazing intensity. You can have a negative relationship, or you can have like a bell-shaped curve where like the grazing intensity that would promote the most this wetland function 3, for example, would be an intermediate grazing. The second objective we'd have is like, rather than looking at those individual metrics, now, can we say something about multifunctionality? Like try to combine all these individual metrics, individual function, into this multi-dimensional functional space. And so what is the grazing management intensity that will enhance the multifunctionality of the system as a whole? So here's an example where you have a very little amount of multifunctionality in the system, where you have a lot of cows, then you go to an intermediate grazing intensity with a lot more functioning, and then you go back to a system with only a few cows, and you have kind of a lower than the intermediate grazing intensity system. So the next is, how do we achieve this? And I'm not going to spend time on telling you how we're going to measure carbon sequestration, how we're going to measure water quality. What I want to talk about next is, how do we create those different grazing intensities in those wetlands at Buck Island Ranch? Because if we can't create those, we don't have a project. And you can do it in 2 different ways. You can go with the traditional way and use physical fences around those wetlands. So, and you can play with how long you leave the gate open to create those grazing intensities across different wetlands in your landscape. The problem is that here it's a picture of Buck Island Ranch, and all those blue colored dots are wetland. We have more than 600 wetlands. So if you were to apply this at a large scale, that would be a lot of work in terms of cost, because you need to fencing material, labor, and maintenance for these fenced. It's also more logistic. When you want to burn the pasture, you have to protect those wetlands because, I mean, it's wood fences, so they will burn too. And you never guarantee that the cow will end up going into that wetland when you open the gate. So we decided to set up an experiment in the South Marsh, and we also have some wetland in Francis Creek. where we fence 15 wetland at BIR and 15 wetland in reserve, and we're gonna open those gates and we're gonna visit them before the grazing event and after, and look at stubble height of different palatable grasses. And we're gonna compare before and after to look at, do we create those grazing intensity by opening gates more, like for a longer period of time? All right. However, there's another solution, maybe the future of grazing management in Florida, who knows? It's to use virtual fences. So for those of you who are not aware, virtual fences have been used for a longer period of time out west. It's only started to come in Florida. And the idea is to put GPS collar around your cow and to train the cow to set that GPS as a unit that can provide sound and also electric shock. So you can train your cow to associate a sound cue to an electric shock, and you can activate that sound around and shock around like virtual boundaries that you can create online. For example, this is a physical fence, but you could lay a virtual fence on top of it as well. So this is, for example, what we did at the ranch. We have 48 cows that have been collared. This is one of our experimental pasture. And currently, the cows are in this. The problem with this new technology, as every new technology, is like, is it really adapted to the Florida climate and the context here? So there's some concern regarding battery life for these, the durability, like what happened when your collar spends so much, like when the cows are grazing in wetland and that collar ends up in wetland for a longer period of time, is it gonna work? And we also don't know if the cow will respect the virtual boundaries we are assigning to them. So how does it work? So you need a relay tower. This is our relay tower at Buck Island Ranch, Dorothy. So you can create online those boundary zone, which is the zone that the cow will receive the warning cue, the sound cue. And then here in this context, the exclusion zone is all around the herd. So in this zone, they will receive a shock if they go through that second dashed line here. And you can, so everything goes from the software that they have. Like we use a specific company, which is called Vents, but it's not the only company that does virtual fencing. And you can assign those, create those virtual boundaries online. So for example, this is the next pasture the cows will go to, which is pasture D, but you don't care about that. And here I can create this exclusion zone around this specific wetland in pasture D. So the white area is the boundary zone with the warning. And then the dark areas, that's where they will be shocked. So the cow has to go first for the warning, and then they get shocked. Usually we want to train them so that they don't get into the shock zone. So the final goal of this project is to really test the technology and its feasibility to manage grazing in wetland in Florida. So we do have sub-questions. Do cow respect the virtual boundaries? How often do we need to change the battery, which could be important? How many GPS collars will fail? That's an important question. And we also want to compare the cost of using virtual fencing versus physical fences. So in December of this last year, I don't know why I put 2024, we collared 48 cows. We selected cull cows because we didn't want to have to deal with frac check during that first year of test. And all the cows, which is really important, all the cows were collared. All the herd has been collared. We didn't collar a subset of them. I'm just gonna go really quickly on how we train the cows. So this is the day one. You can do this in 4 days. It's unbelievable, but you can do it in 4 days. So the first day you establish a boundary that's only the shock zone. There is no sound. There's only sound. So the cow will go close to that boundary, and then there will be shock. And there's a couple seconds after that, they receive the warning sound. You do this for 2 days, and you increase the distance from the physical fence. And then on day 3, what you had is again this like sound zone. That's day 3. And then by day 4, you establish like a virtual fence across your whole pasture, far away from any physical fences. And that's your end day of training. And by then you hope that the cows have been trained properly. So I took the data from our training. So this is after the training. And as you can see, you have this line here, which is the start. And we're pretty happy about that. This is the start of the sound zone. And then you see most of the cows respect that. You do have a few that go up to the shock zone, but very little that are actually crossing the boundary. So we're happy about that. However, I don't want you to come out of this talk thinking that's a great technology. We've probably been lucky at the ranch. We only have 48 collars installed. So some of the collars may have fallen. Like, you have to be careful when you put the collars. You don't want them too tight and you don't want them too loose. The GPS coordinates sometime when the collars go to sleep mode, when it comes back from the sleep mode, are kind of a little off sometime. The collars need to be resynced. There is a latency between the time you provide a new vents to the system and the time it actually syncs to the collar. And there's also a memory space limit. I'm just going to go quickly over this. So the good thing about this, you can follow the cows, individual cow movement in your pasture. But the technology can be used in different ways. We can actually, for ranchers as benefits, you can use the technology to help with cattle movement. And you can also receive warning when a GPS hasn't moved for multiple days. So it might be an indication your cow is having an issue or might be dead. I just wanted to quickly talk about that. Another added bonus that we didn't expected is, as you can see, there's something kind of weird happening down here. So it seems like cows are spending time in this fenced wetland here where they shouldn't be. And so when I saw that last Friday, I ended up, there might be something is amiss. And so I went there, and indeed we have this physical fence between a wetland that was part of our cattle exclusion project and the pasture here that is kind of not necessarily completely down, but low enough that the cows have been able to cross it. Not all of them, apparently only a subset of them I decided to. So that's the end of my talk. Yeah.
So okay, I don't know where to start. Viv.
How do the cows tolerate the collars?
I was a little bit worried when we set them up because I saw them leaving the chute and jumping all around. But right now, when I look at them in the pasture, they look pretty fine with it.
So how bad is the shock, and do they get used to it? And they like?
I didn't try it personally. I wanted to bring some of the spare one we have so I could show people. It's enough that the cows are turning around. So I'm assuming it's not like your little shock. So, but I have no idea exactly how much.
Thanks, Greg. I love this. I think the ranchers in the area are getting really excited about virtual fencing, and the opportunity to make a science tool is fantastic. Do you have to pay extra to vents to get the individual level movements like you showed with the green dots, or
no, you don't need to pay extra. So Vents right now doesn't have a streamlined process to access the raw data. So what we do and we'll have to do is contact our Vents representative to request data from them, and probably on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on how busy they are.
They should develop that.
They used to have it, but they remove it from their system.
Yeah. There was a complicated research agreement for some people, but they're not doing that now. We tried to go through it. I should add that we're also involved at DeLuca with a similar project with vents there with, I think, nearly 500. What's the total number of cows?
200 and right now, collared, it's 220 or something like that.
Yeah. And that's going to interact with both forage utilization, where are the cows, and maybe eventually to what degree can that interact with the locations of grasshopper sparrow nests that need to be protected. But that's, as you said, Josh, a sort of interesting new approach for management. So the grasshopper team, Mary Marine and others are excited about that, and Todd.
And I didn't mention there is a cost. It's like physical fences. There is a cost associated with that system. The tower is about $10,000 if you don't request assistance to set it up. And it's $50 per collar, and that's a rental. So you pay that $50 every year.
But for that, you get the data.
You get the data with that. Okay.
Can you read the online question?
In your opinion, what operational size, acreage wise, is this technology best suited for?
I think it worked best in a system where pastures are a lot bigger, like out west, because it's going to have an influence on the battery life. If the cows are in contact with those virtual boundaries often, which would be the case like in smaller pasture, then you're going to trigger that warning sound more often, which is going to pump energy like from the battery life faster.
Okay, thank you. Todd Jones and the team from Avon Park. Todd is our research biologist overseeing our Avon Park programs, and he's going to be joined by Greg and Mary Marine. So over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm an assistant research biologist here at Archbold, leading the conservation science and military landscapes team. And one of the challenges of our program is we're a little distant from the main station, and we're about an hour north. We do most of our research at Avon Park and the surrounding Sentinel landscape. So we're not down here as much as we would like to be, and we want to keep that connection strong. And so thought this symposium would be a good opportunity to kind of give an overview of the program, to kind of remind people of who we are, what we do, and then have two of our research assistants, so Greg Thompson and Mary Marine, give individual talks on more of the specifics of research on a couple of the threatened endangered species that we do work with. So to give you a quick overview of the program, so it consists of myself as well as 4 research assistants. So each assistant works with threatened endangered species at a specific site. So Greg heads up our research with red-cockaded woodpeckers at Avon Park. We have a new Florida scrub jay lead, Candace Glendo, who's hired back in October, also working at Avon Park. And then Mary Marine does work with Florida grasshopper sparrows at the DeLuca Preserve. And then we're currently searching and doing interviews to replace Liz Abraham, who was our the lead for the Florida grasshopper sparrow work at Avon Park. And I just want to kind of give a quick shout out to all of our partners and collaborators. So we primarily work closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the U.S. Air Force, but we also have a number of other partners and collaborators that make all this research possible. So they're listed here. And then to give you an overview, we have 3 main projects that we're working on right now. So Tiffany kind of introduced the Avon Park Air Force Range, which is a bombing range established back in World War II. So we work primarily on that land as well as the surrounding landscape that you can see outlined in the black there. So we have 3 main projects. We have a cooperative agreement that's been going since the early 1990s. So we have these great long-term data sets on what we call the big 3. So we do research on the red-cockaded woodpecker, Florida scrub jay, and Florida grasshopper sparrow. And so Greg will be giving a talk on more of the kind of the background and history of our red-cockaded woodpecker work. We also have research on threatened, endangered, and at-risk species, mainly grassland birds at the DeLuca Preserve, focusing on the Florida grasshopper sparrow, and Mary will get into that work as well as some of our work at the bombing range. And then we're also involved with a CERTIP grant with researchers from the University of Central Florida, looking at the interactive stressors of fire, ants, and grazing on threatened endangered species, both at Avon Park and DeLuca. And then within these 3 projects, we have a number of collaborators, both here at Archbold as well as externally, like Sarah Fitzpatrick's lab and Nancy Chen's lab. But we're also excited because we're kind of expanding our research efforts and our collaborations, and we're starting work with researchers from the University of Illinois, looking at the wintering ecology of eastern whippoorwills. And so that kind of gives you a broad overview of the program. And I'll kind of give the floor to Greg here to get into our specific work on the red-cockaded wood.
All right, well, hello, everyone. I'm Greg Thompson. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite birds, the red-cockaded woodpecker, and our involvement with the population at Avon Park Air Force Range. So Archbold has been involved with the red-cockaded woodpecker work at the bombing range for quite a while. There were some intermittent surveys that occurred during the 70s and 80s by other entities. But Archbold's involvement began in the early 90s when Reed Bowman and others started going up there to do surveys. And we've been there ever since. We've had a continuous presence at the bombing range, continuously monitoring this population since the early 90s. But we don't do it completely alone. We have collaborators. So we work with US Fish and Wildlife Service and US Air Force staff. But in terms of like the boots on the ground field work and the data analysis, Archbold does most of the heavy lifting for that. Just like the Florida scrub jays here at the station, we have a color-banded population, which allows us to individually identify each of the birds in the population. And because of this continuous monitoring, we now have this really valuable long-term data set that includes both demography and cavity data spanning more than 30 years. So one really nice thing about red-cockaded woodpeckers is that we essentially know what to do for them to grow their populations. And what we have found is that if you burn their habitat frequently, install artificial cavities to alleviate cavity shortages, and do translocations to encourage the formation of new groups, you can kind of expect to see population growth. And that's exactly what we've seen in the Avon Park population. So you can see that in the early 1990s, we had about 19 potential breeding groups or family groups. And it started to increase from there. We reached our US Fish and Wildlife Service recovery goal of 40 potential breeding groups in 2020. And as of 2024, we were up to 48 potential breeding groups. So we've been really satisfied with the growth that we've seen over the years. And Avon Park Air Force Range is not the only population that has seen such a nice positive trajectory and population. That's kind of the case for many of the populations throughout the Southeast. And as a result, this has kind of spurred the US Fish and Wildlife Service to put together a species status assessment. They got together a team of RCW people and US Fish and Wildlife Service staff. That team included Reed Bowman, and they kind of reviewed the data from populations throughout the range of the red-cockaded woodpecker, and they found that there were enough healthy populations to warrant a downlisting from federally endangered to threatened. And that downlisting just became official this past October. So this species is still getting protections and active management, but they've determined that they are not quite as at risk of extinction as they once were. So what now? Now that the species has been downlisted and we've seen all these positive increases in our Avon Park population, going forward, we're still going to continue to monitor this population really closely and keep an eye on different demographic trends. One of the things that we've been looking at recently is first-year juvenile survival within the population. As you would expect, juvenile survival is really important for population growth. You need your young birds to recruit into the population and become adults and breed. So that first graph is just showing that first-year survival is really strongly linked to population growth. And what we've seen is that as the population at Avon Park has increased over the years, juvenile survival has kind of leveled off and even started to decrease a little bit in recent years. And so this is kind of suggesting that there might be some kind of density dependent effects at play. I don't really want to say much more about it beyond that at this point, because we're still kind of looking into it and we're going to dive deeper into that data and try to get some answers. But takeaway is that we're still continuing to closely monitor this population. And a little bit about our long-term vision. Our vision for the species range wide is that we will have forests that are healthy enough to support self-sustaining populations of woodpeckers. And I guess what that looks like, to break it down a little bit, is that we need forests with an abundance of mature trees for them to make their cavities in, as well as some younger trees to replace the mature trees as they senesce. And we need this open, savanna park-like landscape, which is going to be maintained by prescribed fire. We need that understory layer to be nice and low and dominated by herbaceous plants. So if we can create these ideal habitat conditions, the woodpecker should be able to be a little bit more self-sustaining and not rely on our heavy-handed management. So at Avon Park and other populations throughout their range, we're kind of taking a step back and thinking about ways where we could scale back our management efforts and still continue to maintain the populations or grow the populations. So one of the things that we've been thinking about at Avon Park is how do we transition our population from being really heavily reliant on artificial cavities to being more self-sufficient and relying on their natural cavities, the cavities that the birds make themselves. So this graph here is showing cavities by type over the years. So in the early 2000s, the natural cavities, that dark blue color, made up the largest proportion of cavities. So you see like 75% of cavities in 2001 were natural cavities. And then that number starts to go down pretty quickly. And the reason for that is that during that time period, we were installing a lot of artificial cavities on the landscape to try to alleviate any cavity shortages, which there was quite a bit of cavity shortages because the pine stands at Avon Park just were not mature yet. We didn't have a lot of old trees that would allow the birds to make their own cavities. So we put out a lot of artificial cavities in the landscape, and the birds started using them, and they weren't really excavating a lot of their own natural cavities. So more recently, the percentage of natural cavities has started to tick up again. So it reached a low of about 18% in like 2015, 2016, and now we're back up to 34% natural cavities. And one of the reasons why we're moving back in that direction is that we're being more strategic with our artificial cavity installation strategy. So we're still installing artificial cavities. We want to make sure that they're not cavity limited, but we're trying hard not to like over provision artificial cavities. So we're moving in the right direction again, and I'm hoping that we can continue on that trajectory. So I actually gave a talk at this Archbold Research Symposium in 2022. And at the end of that presentation that I gave back then, I talked about wanting to reestablish red cockaded woodpeckers in the southern portion of the bombing range, that area outlined in yellow. There were RCWs in that area back in the 70s, but there have not been any there since, even though there's good habitat in that area. So I talked about, in 2022, I talked about the possibility of building some new recruitment clusters. Recruitment clusters is just us putting artificial cavities into the trees to create like territories. So I talked about potentially doing that as a future action. And the update is that we did that. So in January of 2023, we built 10 new recruitment clusters. In October of 2023, we went up to Osceola National Forest and we captured 10 first-year RCWs and brought them down and released them in this southern area. And from that first translocation of 10 individuals, 5 of them stuck around in South Ridge. So those two, nope, let's not do that. Nope, sorry. I was trying to do the laser pointer. It's okay. The two orange, the center. Okay, yeah. The two orange territories here, there is a potential breeding group, so 1 male and 1 female. And then the yellow has a solitary male. So 5 out of the 10 recruited into the population. And then in October of 2024, we translocated an additional 7 birds, this time coming from Camp Blanding Joint Training Center up a little bit north of Gainesville. And so for this recent translocation, I don't really have an update about how many have stuck around because we're just about to do the census to figure out how many are still around. And then also on the horizon, next year, we're going to be putting together what will be a 50-year management plan. So we're trying to think long-term about future directions for this population of woodpeckers. This plan is going to include things like potential locations for future recruitment clusters, habitat management recommendations, and recommendations for cavity management and translocation as well. I think that's all I've got. I will pass it over to Harry.
Okay, thanks. Yep, so I am Mary Marine, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm going to talk about one of my favorite birds, which is the Florida grasshopper sparrow. So a little bit of background for anyone who might not know these birds. The Florida grasshopper sparrow is a subspecies of grasshopper sparrow. They are secretive ground nesting birds, and they are endemic to South Central Florida grasslands. Up until super recently, as recently as 2015, Florida grasshopper sparrows were considered to be strict habitat specialists that only lived in dry prairie. And then in 2015, monitoring work started at private ranch after a population was found there, suggesting that the species was more adaptable to different landscapes than we originally thought. Florida grasshopper sparrows were federally listed as endangered in 1986. And in 2018, they reached a really low point with fewer than 50 males known across all of the locations that had Florida grasshopper sparrows. And just to really drive home that point, this makes them one of North America's most imperiled songbirds. The primary reason for the decline of the subspecies is habitat loss and degradation and fragmentation. There's a lot of interacting factors, of course, that go into the decline, but habitat loss is considered to be the primary cause because of how much dry prairie has been lost. And this is just kind of a look at the population across the different sites that have Florida grasshopper sparrows that are being monitored. And then that black line on top is the total population summed across the different sites. So you can see how steep the decline was, and then also get a little foreshadowing on some of the recovery that's happened with the different efforts that we are doing in collaboration with a bunch of other organizations. So when we look at the habitat that has been lost for the Florida grasshopper sparrows, this map should give you an idea of kind of, how big of a deal this is from the sparrow's perspective. So the light green areas are areas of pre-settlement dry prairie, and then the dark green are where we still have dry prairie. So not only does this show how much habitat has been lost for the birds, but it also, I think, illustrates really well how much the recovery of this species is dependent on recovering them on working lands and other grasslands, since we just don't have enough Florida dry prairie to recover the species. So what can we do about a species that is so low and has gotten to such a critical point? So in collaboration with the Florida Grasshopper Sparrow Working Group, headed up by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Florida Wildlife Commission in partnership with Archbold and a ton of other people. A few different measures have been enacted at all the monitored sites of Florida grasshopper sparrows that include maintaining a fully color banded population, like you can see here, doing continuous demographic monitoring through point counts and transect surveys. And then my personal favorite part of the work is nest searching for the ground nests that these birds make. with the intention of protecting the nests at a really vulnerable stage. So like any ground nesting birds, the Florida grasshopper sparrows are super susceptible to a wide variety of threats in the nesting stage, both the females and the eggs and the nestlings. So a big part of our work is going out onto the dry prairie or the grasslands, wherever we are, before sunrise, watching the sunrise and listening to the male sparrows perch up like this and start singing in the morning. They perch up and sing to defend their territories, and we can also use their behavior to locate their tiny little nests and find the female, and then usually, well, hopefully the nest. So we'll be out there however many days it takes until we find them. At which point we install a, oh, we good? Okay. We install a predator deflection to deter mammalian and reptilian predators. We also, where applicable, will treat the fire ants that can depredate the nestlings. We treat them non-chemically with boiling water, and we'll do this either with a boiling water pressure washer machine, or as you can see here, kind of more rudimentary way, boiling water in a turkey fryer and digging up the mounds and pouring the water into them. And then the last thing that we'll do is lift the nests anywhere from 1 to about 3.5 inches up from their starting point, because the grasslands where the sparrows live are flood prone, since their nesting season occurs over the wet season here in Florida. So we'll lift the nests to decrease something like this from being a deadly situation for the nest. And then if everything goes according to plan, after about 10 days, we hope to see this, which is a fledgling Florida grasshopper sparrow. So we'll go out, check on the nest, and then once they've popped out of the nest, we'll take down the fence and wish them the best as they go. So all of these efforts have also been supplemented by a conservation breeding program. So in addition to protecting the nests of the wild birds, conservation breeding program was started in 2015 when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Florida Wildlife Commission sort of realized how extreme the decline was and determined that something drastic needed to be done. So from 2015 until 2019, the creation of the conservation breeding program was sort of established at a couple different sites. And you can see here the year that predator deflection fences started being widely used across the site, the year that red imported fire ants were treated at every nest, and then the 2 years where hot shear releases began at Three Lakes Wildlife Management Area and at Avon Park Air Force Range. And you can see the resulting population growth after these different actions were implemented. So Archbold specifically is monitoring Florida grasshopper sparrows at Avon Park Air Force Range, which you've heard a bit about. Avon Park is one of the 2 release sites currently for the conservation breeding program. And in 2024, they had 46 adult Florida grasshopper sparrows at Avon Park. And then DeLuca Preserve, which is right here in yellow, that's where I work. DeLuca is an active, productive cattle ranch. It's 27,000 acres of working land. In 2024, we had 19 Florida grasshopper sparrows. And DeLuca is really essential for the recovery of this species because it gives us a place to study the interactions between Florida grasshopper sparrow conservation and cattle production. And so we have an opportunity to study the synergies between conserving Florida grasshopper sparrows and supporting ranching activities in a way that we hope will be beneficial both to ranchers and to the recovery of the sparrows. So with all of the actions that we take with the nest, we have about 10 years of data on how our different interventions can affect the success of the sparrow nests. So on this left-hand column, we have the daily survival rate of a nest when it is fenced versus unfenced. And then on the right, we have the cumulative survival, which is the probability of that nest surviving through the entire nest cycle when it's fenced versus unfenced. And what you can see is that the cumulative survival increases substantially. We go from about 8% or less than 1% between the two sites to close to 30 at DeLuca and close to 20 at Avon Park. So we see a pretty significant climb that reinforces that those actions are helping get those sparrows through that vulnerable stage of their life. However, with the increased nest survival, other problems started coming to light, such as the annual survival of the adults. So this is a model of the annual survival broken up by age class. So you can see the juvenile survival here and then adult survival on the right. And we've split it up between the Avon Park wild birds, the Avon Park release birds, and the DeLuca birds. And you can see that the survival is not great across the board, but has different trends depending on which group of birds we're looking at. So the wild birds have much lower juvenile survival, likely due to the fact that they have about 20 to 36 extra days in the wild where they're getting eaten that the captive birds don't have, since they're safely at the zoo. But then we see the adult birds, the wild birds, if they survive the juvenile stage, have a higher chance of surviving, and the survival of the release birds drops off dramatically. So that's a big problem and something that needs to be addressed for the sustainability of the growth that we've had. And then this is just the resulting age structure. So this kind of follows exactly what you would expect to see given the survival of the juveniles and the adults. So at Avon Park, where the release birds are being added to the population, but aren't surviving through their expected lifespan, we end up with this really young population indicated by the lighter color bars. And at DeLuca, where the young birds have lower survival, but the older birds are surviving a lot longer, or the adult birds, we end up with these really dark bars that show an old population that isn't being replenished by young birds year to year. Neither one of these is a great sustainable situation. And so a lot of our future work hopefully will be looking into what is going on here and what we can do about it. Which is a great segue into looking forward. So I'll start off with the good news. I mentioned that in 2018, there were less than 50 singing males. As of 2024, there were over 100. So we have seen considerable growth in the population, but there is still a long way to go. So as I mentioned, addressing new research questions, looking into adult survival. And then a really essential component of recovering the species is going to be coming up with the land management recommendations for landowners and expanding Florida grasshopper sparrow conservation work beyond the dry prairie and utilizing the remaining green space in Florida, which is largely ranch land. And DeLuca, like I said at the beginning, is a fantastic backdrop for that, just because of the unique situation of having a ranch that is both a research station, habitat for Florida grasshopper sparrows, and a productive cattle ranch. And I just love this photo because I think it captures really beautifully the future hope that we have of integrating ranching and avian conservation. And we can take any questions.
So I'll just, while we're getting a question ready, I'll also give a huge shout out to the University of Florida, who is the owner and manager of DeLuca, and also to Ducks Unlimited, who manage the conservation easement there. So thank you all for a great talk. So first question, Josh.
Fantastic talks by both of you. Appreciate it and great work. The data set for the grasshopper sparrows is spectacular. And I'm sure you've all thought of this, but the next step seems to be a population viability analysis that would lead to like which of these really intensive management techniques you have to keep doing to get them off of life support. Is that what's coming next? Is someone thinking about that?
Yeah, I think we talk about stuff like that. I hope so. Guess is my answer.
There's, I'll just comment on this real quick. There's a lot of talk in like the working group about demographic information that we need and things like that, but there hasn't been anybody to actually go do it. And so, now I've only been on the job for about 6 months. I'm hoping to dive in, kind of get my claws into that. Like some of these adult survival estimates are the first that have come out of these data sets, even though we've had this, we have over 10 years of data. So I'm hoping to continue that and get into the weeds on those kind of things. Yeah.
I thought it might be worth pointing out, we have no conservation breeding feeding into DeLuca. That's correct. So there's no recruitment of conservation breeding young birds into DeLuca. So that could change those age structures. Oh, sorry, Joe, go on.
All right, we've got a couple online. This first one came up after you had gone through all of the like the really intensive manual labor that you do to protect the nest. It says this is not sustainable to do this for everything, to put that much effort into the protection. What other ways may the sparrows be sustained? And I think you answered that a little bit with the like releases, but is there anything else?
Yeah, so definitely the hope is to get away from putting fences around every sparrow nest and eventually to get away from augmenting the population. I think with a species like the Florida grasshopper sparrow that is, are selected and, has good years and bad years and has a lot of mortality at every stage of life. The kind of pivotal thing that needs to happen is we just need to get them above whatever that threshold is that lets them bounce up and down and have good years and bad years and flooded years and ice snake years or whatever else it is without leaving us with 0 birds. So even though we've got amazing growth over the past few years, we're still sort of at a point where one bad thing happens and we could just like wink out an entire population of the birds. So yeah, the goal is through, experimental land management, learning what we can be doing for these birds, both on dry prairie and in semi-native and improved pastures, that will learn how we can be supporting them other ways and creating habitat that will hopefully start pushing us towards those sustainable numbers that don't need the like individual bird intervention.
I know we're running over, but they did start late, so I'll just allow one more question either
Okay.
offline or from the audience. You guys decide.
Right.
I'm sure the team will answer any online questions afterwards.
For the grasshopper sparrow with the decline in adult survivorship over time, do you think that there's almost too much acclimation to human activity in their captive releases that might be impeding their natural ability to, forage or behave in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question and definitely something that we talk about a lot as a group and like have to consider whenever you're doing things like this. I will say that the hatch year release birds have pretty good recruitment into their second year. And I mean, I say pretty good. None of it's good. None of it's great. But like you saw in the graph, from juveniles into their second year, they have the highest recruitment between the different categories that we separated out. And then they also are successful with pairing, defending territories, and raising and fledging young. And so I think if we were seeing like poor survival of the release birds because of human acclimation, I think we wouldn't necessarily see that first year be so productive for them, if that makes sense. But it's complicated in a lot of ways. And any person in the working group that you ask that question to would probably give you a slightly different answer. So that's my take on it. But, put that in the context of a lot of people have their heads together on this. So, ask me again in 5 minutes, I might give you a slightly different answer.